So I can start with the introduction that I have prepared. Is quite extensive, it's quite long, but I'm gonna go for it because I'm really happy with you, Lex Bouter, and then Rik Peels having you here today. So my name is Eirini Botsari, and I am the community manager of the OCCR, which stands for the Open Science Community Rotterdam. OCCR welcomes academics and support staff working at Erasmus University and Erasmus Medical Center. We discuss, promote, and adapt open and transparent scientific practices at every stage of the research cycle, from the initial idea to the final product. Most of you are acquainted with OCCR, and some of you are members of this community. I would like to take this chance and thank you for your interest and support. In case you are not a member of our community and want to become one, you can always email me and I will provide you with all the necessary information and instructions on how to join our community. And I will attach my email address in the chat below. We organize journal clubs, talks on various topics related to open science, reproducibility, and workshops. Today is Reproducibility Day, and we're going to discuss the paper Replication and Trustworthiness by Professor Lex Bouter and Professor Rik Peels. We're delighted to have these two researchers on our side and discuss with them the topic of trustworthiness and replication. I would like to give a small introduction of our today's guests before giving them the floor. Rik Peels is the recipient of an ERC starting grant entitled Extreme Beliefs, the Epistemology and Ethics of Fundamentalism. And he is also leading a TWCF-funded project on progress in the university. He works as an associate professor in the philosophy department and the beliefs and practices department. If you may not have seen it coming, his main research topic is the ethics of belief. He is worth to be Google searched. Now, Lex Bouter's short biography ended up being 2 pages on Google. He comes a long way with a lot of valuable work on epidemiology. Until 2006, he was the director of MGO Plus Institute for Health and Care Research at the VU University Medical Center in Amsterdam. He moved from the Netherlands Epidemiological Society in 1996 to the Committee for Health Research on Disasters COVID-19. In 2014, his tenured professorship on epidemiology was broadened to methodology and integrity. In 2017, he organized the 5th World Conference on Research and Integrity in Amsterdam and became chair of the World Conferences on Research Integrity Foundation. I can keep on going with both of their valuable work and input in academia and outside of it, but I would like to give them the space to introduce their work on replication and trustworthiness. I'm a big fan, so I do not want my view to further influence yours. I'm sure, though, you will be inspired. As a gentle reminder to our participants, I would like to point out one last time the rules of this meeting. If possible, please wear headphones. Video is optional. Pay attention to the moderator, and that is me. If you have questions, you can click on the raise hand button. That is from my part. Now, Lex and Rik, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Eirini. With this introduction, we can only disappoint. It's a bad start in a way, but we'll try anyway. What we have is a few slides and our presence for interaction. So I assume that people have read the paper. Rik will introduce it a little bit, and I will do some generic introductions. And let me start with this slide. In a way, it's also the history of my personal engagement in the field of research integrity over the last decade. When I started about 10 years ago, everyone was talking about the capital sins of research: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, FFP, like they say in North America, and their damaging, devastating results on trust and truth. And it's all about quality and integrity, of course. And then a few years down the line, people started to realize that these things, while they are awful, aren't that common. But what is common is the generic corner cutting we nowadays called questionable research practices or detrimental research practices, some other people call it. And these also damage trust and truth, and maybe even more than FFP, because they are so common. Together, these are the evils we were talking about in the bubble of research integrity. And then we realized that there was another bubble that identified a replication crisis. And that meant that when you redo a study, typically you don't get the same answer. And that was alarming and disappointing. And we understood so little from it. And that also started about 10 years ago in 2012, 2013. And then on the horizon was the wonderful story of open science. I often label it as open everything, because they want to open everything in this sect: open methods, open codes, open data, and open peer review. And these are all wonderful ideas to foster, first and foremost, transparency and accountability of research. You can check and reuse and modify plans by others. It's really wonderful. And by that virtue, it promotes trust and truth as well. So these are the green fields, the good ones. You understood that by now, most likely. And then, of course, we also discovered that these responsible research practices were nothing more and nothing less than open science modalities plus a few more. So here these two fields became connected through the responsible research practices. They played down the replication crisis. They also played down the questionable research practices, and they played down fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So this slide is a story, more or less personal story of the last decade, but also has the main purpose to explain that open science and research integrity are two sides of the same coin. That's basically the idea. And now I'd like to talk about a little bit about research we've done in the Netherlands. I will skip the Amsterdam research integrity study, but my slides are made available, and then below the screen you see all the references to the papers and the PhD thesis involved. It's really was interesting work, but I will focus on the National Survey on Research Integrity that was launched a few years ago and published recently. And here are a few observations. We had 11 questionable research practices in that survey. I report here on the 5 most prevalent of them. They all had a scale from ranging from 1 to 7, 7 being always, often, that type of thing, and 1 being a never. So this is on the upper end of the scale, and that we use to define prevalence. Now, selective reporting, being not submitting or resubmitting a valid negative publication, 17.5%, self-admitted to that. We don't believe it will be an overestimation, and if it's wrong, it might be an underestimation. Same holds for insufficient mentioning of flaws and limitations in the studies. We call that spin, technically downplaying your limitations and exaggerating a little bit what you like in your results. 70% admit to that. Insufficient supervising or mentoring the people below you, PhD students, regular students, postdocs, what have you, 15% admitted to that. Insufficient attention to equipment, skills, and expertise, again, about 50%. And inadequate bookkeeping of your research, again, about 50%. When we take them all together, we defined any frequent QRP as being at least one of these 11 QRPs with a score on the upper end. And that was more than half of the participants in this survey. So yes, that makes it common, the questionable research practices. But we were slightly surprised by our estimates of fabrication and falsification. We skipped plagiarism because we consider that to be another domain. But more than 4% fabrication and more than 4% falsification, which is higher than other estimates. well, a bit more until double the number, and it's still not rare. So it means that when you are in a department of 25 people, on average, one of them admits to fabricating data during the last 3 years at least once. That's a lot. Well, that person won't be in your department, of course. The department next to you will have 2 of these persons, but still, on average, it's not that nice. We looked at the open science stuff as well. We had responsible research practices, same rhythm, selection of 5, highly prevalent, almost completely everyone agreed to that, is that admitting funding and conflict of interest. That's mandated, of course, by universities and funding agencies and journals. Fair principles for data reposition, 3/4, highly adopted by the European Union and the Dutch organizations for funding of research as well. Publishing open access, more than 70%, which is also a thing in continental Europe and the UK, much more than in other parts of the world still, but sounds nice, and it is nice. Openness in the sense of open codes, open syntax, and open data, less than half. So we see room for improvement there. And pre-registration of study protocols, a bit more than 40%. So again, a lot of improvement room there as well. My final slides from the same national survey on research integrity deals with, in a qualitative way, in the explanatory factors we included in the survey. They're not all on the slides, they're only on the slides when there was a meaningful, statistically significant result, and it's displayed qualitative with an arrow. So green is good, red is bad, and the direction of the arrow is the direction of the association. And it is an association, please bear that in mind. It was a cross-sectional survey, so we don't have the pretension to say anything about causality. It's only indicative. When people thought that reviewers might detect their misbehavior, that was associated with reporting less of that misbehavior, which was to be surprised. It's not a surprise. People expected that, especially the criminologists among us. When you threat with punishment, that might help. That's the idea. Perceived publication pressure, more questionable research practices, less responsible research practices. Adhering to supporting academic norms like the Metonian norms, all the expected directions, less research misconduct and less questionable research practices, more responsible research practices, experience organizational justice, lowest questionable research practices when the organizational justice is perceived to be high. This is interesting, and there is some other research on this. It's quite, and all the scales were more or less validated or established already. Mentoring for survival, that is a mentor helping you to cut corners to survive in academia as it currently is. Yes, you do that by utilizing questionable research practices. That's suggestive here. Mentoring to do the good thing, to do the open science and to do the responsible research practices. More responsible research practices, less questionable research practices. Competitiveness, when the experience to be high or hyper competition, even more corner cutting, work pressure the same. This was weird that work pressure also elevated the engagement in responsible research practices, but here the causality, if anything, may go the other way around. It's a lot of work, these responsible research practices, so that may be the reason that you experience an even higher work pressure. And then we have funding pressure, and that's about the same story, and that might be mixed by the fact that funders predominantly seem to like responsible research practices increasingly. So when you feel funding pressure, you better engage in these things, in these goodies. Okay, so far my brief introduction, open for discussion later, of course, but I now hand over to Rik, and I will click his slide. So Rik, let me be your charming assistant.
All right, thanks so much, Lex. So I would like to share a couple of thoughts about this article that we published recently, Replication and Trustworthiness. And just to be clear, Lex and I have written a couple of papers on replication in the humanities in particular, because that is a rather new thing and has its challenges of its own. But this particular paper, Replication and Trustworthiness, is about replication in general and trustworthiness in general. How do the two relate? And we thought that was an important question, because if you think about it, there's something intuitive about there being a clear relation, right? So in the face of the replication crisis, also called trust crisis, if we successfully replicate a study, doesn't that increase trustworthiness of what we're doing, in particular, the results of the original study? But if you start to think about it, there are actually a whole lot of questions regarding the relation between the two. So a couple of them, you might wonder, what exactly is the object of trust? So what is to be trustworthy? Is it the findings of the primary study? Is it the quality of the study protocol of the original study? The combined findings of the primary study and its replication? Only the main findings, or all the findings reported, or yet something else, right? So the exact object. Is it required that a study is actually successfully replicated before we can trust it? Does a study being replicable, so it has the features of potentially being successfully replicated, but not yet a replication has been carried out, does that already make it more trustworthy? Does a successful replication always increase trustworthiness? Does a failure to replicate successfully, does that decrease trustworthiness? Right, so there's a whole host of questions to be asked there. We address a couple of those in this particular paper. Just a word on the terminology as well. We are focusing on being trustworthy, so particularly the original results or the findings being trustworthy. And that is a different thing from being trusted. So research findings can be trusted, or the authors can be trusted, for instance, because they have a high status in the field. But of course, it doesn't follow that the original results are trustworthy. So we're concerned with being worthy of trust and an increase in worthiness of trust. And finally, the difference already hinted at between replicability and successful replication. So we take it that replicability is the combination of properties of a study that make replication possible in the first place. So for instance, things like transparency about the method employed or data collection, things like that. And a successful replication is a case in which we carry out a replication study and the results are sufficiently similar, let's say, to the ones of the primary study. All right, let's go to the next slide. What is a successful replication? A bit more about that. There are various options. So the study can have the same direction of findings. It can have the same direction of findings with a similar effect size. And the third option is same direction of findings, similar effect size, and similar position. And of course, the more of these, the better, of course, in a sense. We believe it's important to pay attention to three different types or kinds of replication. And they're often distinguished by naming them respectively reproduction, direct replication, and conceptual replication. So just to be clear on those, a reproduction we take to be a reanalysis of the data from the primary study. Whereas a direct replication is a case in which we collect new data with the same research protocol as the primary study. And a conceptual replication, so the third kind of replication, has to deal with collecting new data with a somewhat revised or somewhat different research protocol. Okay. And you may wonder, well, how exactly does trustworthiness relate to each of these three different kinds of replication? Well, we take it that a direct replication adds a bit more to the trustworthiness of the original findings than just a reproduction. And that is because it demonstrates that sampling variability has no strong influence on the findings of the original study, and thus lowers the chance or likelihood of chance findings. And we take it that a conceptual replication adds even more to the trustworthiness of the original results or the original findings. And that is because for a conceptual replication, methodological choices that we're varying apparently don't influence the findings and thus strengthen the validity. So we actually measure what we aim to measure. Right, so there is something of a hierarchy in terms of for these different kinds of replication, in terms of how they relate to trustworthiness. Now, it's of course also possible that one unintentionally replicates a particular study, if you can still speak of replication of that study. But the idea is, because they can also take place simultaneously, for instance, right? But one important point we try to make in the paper is that the issue of intentionality or unintentionality is really not that important when it comes to trustworthiness. So in an unintentional replication, and that tends to be a conceptual replication, adds as much to the trustworthiness of the primary findings or the original findings as an intentional one, right? It doesn't really matter because it's about, for instance, about whether new data point in the same direction. And a final important point we make in the paper has to do with stakes. And the basic idea is, it's actually somewhat influenced by a philosophical idea called pragmatic encroachment. And that is a complicated theory, but the basic idea is this, that there are situations in which the practical stakes matter for whether we speak of something. So for example, trust. So let's just talk about trust. And here's an example from a context beyond academia. So imagine that I've got a gun in my hand. I actually don't, but imagine that I do have one. And imagine that there's a 1% chance that this gun is loaded. But now imagine that the purpose is just to shoot in the air because we're just, say, celebrating a military victory, right? Well, in that case, if it's only a 1% chance that it's loaded, I would shoot in the air. And I actually looked it up. There's a very small chance that it hits somebody and that that person gets injured as a result of that, but very small chances. So that seems a perfectly safe circumstance to shoot the gun into the air, even though there's a 1% chance that it's loaded. But now take a different situation, namely one in which I'm pointing the gun to a particular person. Well, if then there's a 1% chance that it's loaded, then of course I cannot trust the gun, right? I can't trust that it's empty. And this is called pragmatic encroachment. And the idea is pragmatics. So what is at stake, what depends on it, that matters to whether we can properly trust that something is the case. In this case, whether the gun is loaded. In another case, whether we can trust the findings of a study. So what we would like to suggest is that the more that depends on whether or not the original findings are true or correct, the higher the bar for trustworthiness, so to say. So if the study concerns, I don't know, the occurrence of a particular verb in a work of Shakespeare, that's a big deal maybe, but not, of course, not as big a deal as, for instance, whether a vaccine has harmful side effects, right? Or maybe something Lex and I have been working on lately. If you carry out a replication on a study on Rembrandt, so it's an authentication issue, is it an original Rembrandt or not? In that case, it does matter quite a bit, maybe not as much as life or death issue, but still it matters quite a bit. Right, so that's practical stakes. So to wrap up the paper, the conclusion is basically this, that trustworthiness of research findings depend on the following 5 things: the prior probability of the findings, so how likely they are independently of a posteriori collected evidence. Second, the study size and the methodological quality. Third, the number of replications that were performed. So of course, ceteris paribus, the more the better, ceteris paribus. The consistency of the findings, and finally, what is at stake. Those are, I think, the main points of the paper, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on it. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. I have many questions, but I don't want to hijack the whole meeting with my questions. So if other attendees would like to ask their questions, I'm more than happy to shut up and then I can ask mine.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Hey, hopefully you will not regret it. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much. So the first question that I have is for Lex, because so I follow with great interest the research, the survey on research integrity. and also how it unfolded. And also, I would say how disappointing it was that some institutions in the Netherlands did not really do anything they could to push internally, to advertise internally this this survey. But I consider it, and I think I'm not alone in this, I consider it one of the best, if not the best set of evidence when it comes to questionable research practices that we have to date. Also the most trustworthy. But there is something that's stuck and that I would really like to discuss with both of you and everybody else present. So there is this idea that also that came out in the answers to the survey. Basically, if a researcher is afraid of being detected, they'll behave better, right? And this is like a pretty self-explanatory thing if you want in any other field of life, but it seems to be, you know, like not super prominent in the academic discourse, as if academics are not humans, or they don't, you know, like follow, you know, like they don't respond to incentives that they have around them. So, which means that, you know, like if you're afraid of being detected, you'll behave better. So who should check that people behave in, you know, in a way that is transparent, that is trustworthy? Because there are several stakeholders in the chain. You know, you can think, oh, the reviewers should do it, or journal editors should do it, publishers should do it. That would be their added value. Finally, we'd have some added values for some of the biggest publishers. Funding agencies should do it. They get the, you know, they give the money. They should be the ones who also check that the policies are enforced. Universities. So what's your take on this? Who should check?
Wow, it's a great question, but a bit complex as well, of course. The point is that I don't believe that there is one single agency that has the unique responsibility for this. The point is that yes, researchers are humans as well, and well, you can shape their behavior to some extent with sticks and carrots. We like carrots more, and we know that carrots are more effective usually, but we should not forget about the stick. And this is about the stick. When people expect to be caught, when driving your car, you see the camera and you see, well, the likelihood that I'm caught is quite high. So let's cool down with the velocity. The same may be present here. And the main thing to me is that you make clear that the opportunities for being caught are maximized. And that has again to do with openness. When you demand open data, open methods, open codes, anyone can catch you when you made a mistake. So that seems to me a good way to make the stick a bigger as well. Having said that, I've given a lot of lectures for the editors and publishers, and I always say, hey, listen, to them, what you sell is one thing, quality assurance. So why don't you check as good as you can? And the rich publishers, they do have some personnel. There is now an emerging software suite that can screen papers for tortured sentences, for falsified pictures, for weird p-values, for plagiarism, what have you. That needs to be developed further, and people should know that they run the risk that this stuff is utilized when they send a manuscript in or a paper in. That doesn't mean that their supervisor or their colleagues or the leaders of their institutions or the funding agencies have no responsible whatsoever, and that they have no responsibility themselves whatsoever, but we're all in the same game and all stakeholders should collaborate. But I believe specifically that publishers can and should do better, because it's the only thing they sell. They sell our work, and their work should be quality assurance.
Thank you. I mean,
Rik, you want to add to that?
Oh, I couldn't agree more, Lex. I just thought that maybe in addition, sometimes one has to strike the right balance between creating like enough and severe stakes, really, and trusting people. So so we're talking about trust in a different sense now. But there, I mean, there's intrinsic goodness to trust, but there is also a highly motivational role in being trusted, right? But of course, this shouldn't create the opportunity for people to misbehave. So one has to balance the two. But there, I think there is also a possibility of there being too many controls and checks, and the stick being too large. So I would fully agree with Lex that make the carrot as big as possible and the stick as small as possible, but not too small.
Thank you. That's interesting because I think we've, correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that we've used many carrots, but I don't think we have really implemented many sticks. So while I understand in principle what you're saying, Rik, that we shouldn't really exaggerate in having, you know, like a excessive consequences, or you know, like a very bureaucratic way of of checking you know, like everything. I don't think we're there. So
yeah, that is a good point, of course, as well, Antonio. When I'm teaching about research integrity, especially for PhD students and postdocs, and I tell them always about some big cases like Diederik Stapel and Don Poldermans in the Netherlands. I often get the question, what happened to these people? How were they punished once they were caught out? And my students can hardly believe that how little the punishment is. Don Poldermans, for instance, he had to leave Rotterdam University Hospital, and he became a cardiologist in the hospital next door. Not that much happened to his career. Diederik Stapel was forced to leave as well. Well, he had some difficulty finding jobs, but he is teaching again, and he's doing a lot of different things, not doing research anymore. And I'm not sure whether that's right or good, because when you make it a legal thing, mainly research integrity, when you focus on sanctioning people. And I've been chairing committees on well, allegations of research misconduct, and often there are lawyers on two sides, and then a normal conversation is almost impossible. So it damages the learning opportunities which are there. So for questionable research practices, we should never sanction and well, put sanctions on people. There, optimizing the learning opportunities is important. And it's like in hospitals. You may know that in hospital safety increased enormously when they invented a thing called blame-free reporting, where you can report your errors and sort out together how to prevent them in the future. That's much better than finding culprits and punishing them. But I admit that some errors are so awful that they need to be sanctioned, but we should be careful there as well.
The issue also matters, for instance, for how you craft research integrity codes. So if you pay attention to codes across different countries and even the continents, you'll notice that some of them are cashed out in terms of desirable behavior or virtues, whereas others are cashed out in terms of the punishment you get if you misbehave. So if I'm Lex, am I right? If I remember correctly, the one of Japan is cashed out primarily in terms of the punishment you get if you misbehave. And
yeah, that's true, and the US codes are even more in that direction. The US were there before most other countries in awareness of research integrity problems, but they made it legalistic and rather box ticking, which we like to do differently in continental Europe. Australia is like continental Europe, and Japan is more like the US. That's true.
Yeah.
And for sure, I don't know what is best and what is worse, but like one of my colleagues said in the past, and Jan might remember that even, you cannot do it without problems. But what you can is choose which type of problems you like most.
Thank you. That was yeah, that's a great maxim. Okay, so I think, so for me, like the more we talk about these these issues, the more questions I have. But maybe yeah, considering this was also a reproducibility journal club, and Rik was yeah, so kind to like highlight the main points of the paper. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit, and I have questions about that paper as well. Again, if nobody else has questions, because I feel like I talk too much always. No? Okay.
Take your floor, take your opportunity.
Ah, there's Jan with the question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Sure.
Fine. Yeah, my question, I'm from the field of psychology, and I'm wondering, suppose that I'm doing a replication after 20 years, 30 years from the original study, and I find a difference. How can I judge that this difference is due to indeed that the original study is not valid enough, it's not real science, or is it perhaps that the reason is that the object of study, the people I'm studying, are changed over time? Yeah. So is there a kind of time frame we need to have in order to have a good, valid replication study?
Yeah, really great point you're raising, Jan, and I'm sure that Rik can say a lot about it as well. I'll take the simple angle, and you can do the more complex stuff than Rik later on. The point is, in the early days of the replication crisis, which social sciences was rather prominently involved in that, people tend to think that this was about research misconduct, that it was about unmasking fraudulent research, or at least really poor, bad research. But the truth of the matter is that replication studies say hardly anything about truth. It's about reproducibility. It's about random error. It's about getting the same answer. So when they differ, a primary study and a replication attempt, one may be right, one may be wrong, or both may be wrong. We don't know, and we have no clue. We really have no clue. And then later on in the field, the tendency developed to focus on explanations of differences in findings between a primary study and its replications, because often there are multiple replications. And that turned out to be a really fascinating field. It started already in animal research in the 50s. They didn't talk about replicability, but they did the same animal type of research. And then they discovered, for instance, that the temperature of the light in the room where the animals was kept was decisive for the outcome of some experiments. They would never have detected that when they wouldn't redo an experiment. They also detected that when there were female caretakers of the animals, their cycle matters for the outcomes of some experiments, which no one thought about before. So you can learn a lot from studies not being replicable, no replication success, and then you should delve deeper in the potential causes. It's not a randomized thing, so causality inference is difficult again, but in your example, Jan, it might be the case that when you are 20 years later, the subjects, the culture, the habits, everything might have changed. And in fact, and now I hand over to Rik, in the humanities, that there are strong objections against even the idea of replicability, partly for this reason, that they say our object is a moving target. So we cannot replicate our research. We can do it once only.
Yeah. So that is a common objection that we've encountered, and I can imagine that it holds for certain cases. So if your object of study is a particular group of people somewhere in the 90s, say, well, that group of people is no longer available to us. I mean, maybe there's those same people, but no longer in the 90s, right? So the object of study. So I therefore, in such case, I think the criteria for replicability fail in the first place, right? We can't access the same object. We can't collect further data about that object. However, so for the humanities, though, I think there are other cases in which, even though the object is unique, you can access it multiple times. So you mentioned a painting by Rembrandt. There are also other artifacts that we can access easily many times with different methods, getting out new data. And I think the same holds in physics. So even in physics, there are unique objects like space-time as a whole, or maybe the origin of life on Earth. If there was only one origin, right? You can collect further data about that same event. So it's so it's tricky, and it depends on the object and also what the conclusion is. So if the conclusions or results of the study in the 90s was more general, so makes claims, for instance, about, I don't know, people in the West generally, then maybe it is possible to do a replication study. And if that leads to different findings, I think all that we can say for now is, look, there are different findings, and that calls for further research. It doesn't follow that the original results are false or that the new ones are right or the other way around, or we don't really know. So that calls for further research. Maybe the original person was sloppy, maybe the new researcher was sloppy, right? There can be a change in background conditions. Who knows? A lot of things can have happened. But I think so. What we're encountering really is that replication studies are so helpful when it comes to getting insight into the process of carrying out a study, right? I think that's where for many cases, particularly in the humanities, much of its value lies. Even apart from the trustworthiness of the original findings. But of course, that's another thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, somewhat related, because you talked about replicating previous research on 3 levels, where the credibility of trustworthiness grows or increases from replication to direct replication to conceptual replication. But I think the problem is, mainly the failure to replicate previous findings. And then the first author of the original research then says, of course, the research has not been properly replicated, in especially direct replication or conceptual replication, because that's further off the original research. And of course, the original researcher says, you did it wrong. Also.
Yeah, you take this one first, Rik.
Yeah. Yes. So thank you, Lydia, for your question. I think that can happen, but it doesn't need to happen. So with the replication projects, so we're carrying out 3 replication projects now. For all 3 of them, the original authors are not on board in the sense that they participate themselves, but they're in the picture, so they can give feedback and so on. And so far, I think they're pretty open-minded, and they're open towards them missing out on things originally, or there being new data that shed new light on the same phenomenon, right? So I mean, it can happen that the original authors say, look, you made a mistake, but it doesn't need to happen, right? And of course, I think that's only the starting point. So of course, it can happen that the original author says, look, you made a mistake here, and then the person needs to back that up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. The point is, of course, that some people find it scary when someone else is trying to replicate your study.
Exactly.
Because they start wondering immediately, what did I do wrong? Did I do something wrong? And then the 3 types of replications have different implications, maybe. When you do a reproduction, you take the data set, you take the data analysis plan of the primary investigator, and you detect real flaws there. That is a flaw, that is an error by the primary investigator. So that might be the most scary. When you collect new data with the same protocol, the direct replication, when you have something different, then that already may be a chance finding, because you have a different sample. And that can happen. Statistical variability, just random noise you're capturing. And then when you have the courage to do a conceptual replication, then the issue is you're tweaking the research design, trying to keep in the same research question, but using other methods, using more methods. Then you might get other answers, but you have no clue whether that's because of your tweaking of the methodology or because it's a really different answer.
Yeah.
And only the conceptual replication in that sense bears a little bit of validity, in the sense of that it bears on generalizability of the finding when you use slightly different methods, slightly different population, and so on and so forth. When it is successful, it's powerful, but when it fails, a conceptual replication, you hardly learned anything. And that's the reason that many people recommend do a reproduction first, then a direct replication, and then start thinking about the conceptual replication.
Yes. Yeah.
When you step out of that, you can collaborate with them. And that is something we did wrong in the Netherlands replication study program. I was the chair of that. There was a small granting fund available, and we forbid it, any contact with the original investigators.
Oh.
And now I believe that might have been a mistake, that we were too careful there.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
If I may add,
Sorry.
Eirini, no, yeah, you want to say something?
I wanted to ask a question.
Oh, please.
That maybe it's a bit more vague than the rest being asked, but I'm curious because what I keep on thinking and combining research as we talk about it right now is memes. You know, the memes on the internet, and then they're being replicated again and again. Hard to find even the original idea sometimes. And I think it can be either like a conceptual replication, even a direct one, like it can really be applied on my head like that. And then I'm thinking about the trust crisis that it is going on around us in humans. So how can we maybe assess or understand or maybe reach people where they generally have a low trust, and how can they trust research in that sense?
Wow. Rik, that's in your field. I'll try to add later on.
Yeah. So I think just to be clear, like in the Netherlands, for instance, trust in science is still incredibly high. So I think it's the highest level of trust among all public institutions. So I think we should take the trust crisis seriously, but we're still doing fairly okay, I think. But I think the trust crisis or the replication crisis is only one of the things that cause the trust crisis. So another thing is that the media, for instance, have a tendency to publish any interesting result. For instance, cooking this particular food and cancer. Anything that comes out, they publish it straight away. So if we can somehow entice the media to be slightly more, to take a step back and to share results with a larger public, only once, for instance, they have been systematically replicated, that would, I think, actually increase public trust in science, because then people won't have to change their mind on things. So one thing, they read one day, look, there is a correlation, well, they don't distinguish, there's a relation between cooking up spinach for the second time and like getting cancer, and like a few years later there's no such relation, and a few years later again it's back on the table, and they get confused, right? So so if we can teach not just the public but media about the nature and value of replication, for them to hold back and publish results only, or share results only when they've been replicated, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I agree. I'm on the committee of the Royal Society of Arts and Sciences in the Netherlands, and we are reflecting on what COVID meant for the interaction between science and society. And that's weirdly complex, and it's impossible to write a good report about it. But one of the elements is how the conspiracy theories and how trust developed in this specific circumstance. And we are going to to say in that report that we need to educate the population better about what it is research, and what it is not, and what it is not that is getting it right. We almost never get it right. And when you look a few years later, the answer will be different, more nuanced or radically different. And that's all part and parcel of the scientific method. What we are accountable for as researchers is to do our utmost best and not be distracted by our personal gains and stuff like that. So no conflict of interest and that type of stuff. To do the best job we can, but we are not obliged to get it right, because in science we almost never get it completely right, and we should be open about it. And also in COVID times, the knowledge was so uncertain and sometimes completely wrong. But it was wonderful that there was research on these issues, and part that led to wonderful developments and quick development of vaccines, for instance. But on the other hand, also the conspiracy theories were fueled by the fact that science often got it completely wrong. So that is an important thing, and I agree with Rik that we need to educate journalists in that sense, and in a way we are blessed already in the Netherlands with really good science journalists. There are many countries where it's much worse, but it can still be done better. But also the general public. And when you look at trust and conspiracy indicators, it's so strongly connected to level of education of the people involved. So it has to do with education. And this might be a naive stance, it might be impossible, but I believe it's one of our responsibilities collectively. We don't need to be a genius, all of us, to be able to reach out to the society and to explain these things, but at least some of us should be able to reach out to society and to explain these things. And like in the COVID times, some scientists did wonderful jobs in communications and others did awful jobs. I'm not going to mention names.
So there is, in a way, this tendency of humans to idealize the work that scientists do. So when the results or the conclusions change in the discourse, this can
it's
be...
a naive sense.
Yeah.
They think we claim that we have the truth, found the truth.
The master, huh?
Yeah, well, that's a weird idea when you are in the game of doing science.
Yeah. Thank you both.
I mean, if it was for me, I would go on forever, because I've got so many points, especially when it comes to the paper, that I have some slight disagreements that I wanted to talk about, but it's already 3. So I think, Eirini, it's up to you to decide, and of course up to our guests to decide what to do.
I would say it's up to our guests, because to me, it's totally fine.
Yeah, I can go on a few more minutes, but not more. I've another meeting waiting.
I've got 10
I have
more
to leave.
minutes.
Sorry.
So.
Bye, Lydia. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Okay, goodbye. Nice having you.
Yeah, I've got 10 more minutes or so.
Okay, but then which one do I what do you hit you with? What do I hit you with? So I think you might be aware of studies so papers by Bernard de Wezer and collaborators, and if not, I'll put the links in the chat. So they have developed formal models, formal mathematical models, to try and understand more optimal ways in which behaviors in which that are conducive to truth seeking and finding truth in science. So I think it's brilliant work. It's one of the most transformative work that I've seen recently. And one of the things that they talk about is that, and something that you have already mentioned, is that true results are not necessarily reproducible, and false results might still be reproducible. And this can be due, for example, to model misspecification or measurement error. So allow me to ask the provocative question before we go. If replication studies do not allow us to distinguish between true and false results, then what's the use of it?
To me, the use of it, that it shows whether the result is replicable or not, in the sense of suffering from a lot of random error, whether there is systematic error or bias. Replication is poor at it. And when I'm teaching about it, I always say, when you replicate a completely flawed study design, you get the same wrong answer. That is what you get. It's the same answer, which is great. You have been successful in replication, but the disaster is that it's still wrong. You don't make it right. So replication, with an exception, a slight exception I mentioned before of conceptual replication, is not about validity. It's about reproducibility. It's about precision. Nothing more, nothing less. And that means that replication isn't everything we need. We also need to criticize the methods, the experimental approach taken, the ways people try to reduce a problem in real life, because that is what research is all about, of course, reduction. And for that you need to think. Sometimes there is no substitute for do the thinking work. Would you agree, Rik?
Yeah, I fully agree. There are a couple of things to be gained there. And another thing is, I think that in quite a few cases, it will turn out that a study is not replicable in the first place. So we can't carry out a replication study, for instance, because there is much unclarity about how the data were collected or what criteria there were postulated for relevant sources in the humanities, for historical sources, those sorts of things. So it will generally increase transparency, for instance, hopefully. And of course, in the case of successful conceptual replications, I think that if that happens multiple times, then we do get good evidence to think that the original results are true or close to the truth or something along those lines. So that gets you into the philosophy of science, the issue of truth. Yeah. Yes, I'm not much of a Popperian there, so I think we can actually get a hold of the truth every now and then.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I mean, there's also a lot more that we can talk about with respect to, like the strength of theories in some disciplines that make it really difficult to even think about an interesting replication attempt, because the formal, so the theory is so underspecified that you can go in every direction and the theory will not be touched.
That's true, of course. We had a very interesting discussion, you would like that, Antonio, a few weeks ago on a paper of Anna Scheel. She explained in that paper that some hypotheses in psychology are so poorly defined that we shouldn't bother about trying to replicate these studies. And she had a point, of course. We didn't agree completely, but we had a nice afternoon of discussion about it.
Yeah, in her recent paper.
We're in touch with her as well, so.
That's great, that's great.
Yeah. She's already been.
She's part of our family now. She comes from Eindhoven, but she's now working in Amsterdam as well.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. So let me add to that. One of the things we aim to do in this, one of the things we aim to do in this project as well is to set up a study in which we compare replication across radically different disciplines. For instance, biomedicine, social psychology, art history, and I don't know, history maybe, or just science and religion. So that's one of the things we're interested in. Yeah, and even like in some cases, even the propriety of the use of terms like data and hypotheses, even that is questionable in some cases.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, when is it data? For instance, when you're doing history, is that the boring stuff you find in archives, or is it what you take out of that archive? Are these your notes? And the same when you make pictures like MRI pictures. Well, what is it? The bits and pieces that come out of the machines, or after the formulas have digested the stuff, or when it's interpreted by a radiologist? Well, what is data? It's not that easy when you start thinking about it.
Indeed. Thank you. I mean, I think, Eirini, I really don't want to continue anymore, because otherwise we can go on forever. So I let you close the meeting.
No, I think also Rik and Lex did have a limited time left. So we don't want to take any more of your time, but it was a pleasure having you, a pleasure having the chance to ask you these questions that they were revolving around my head as well, and the rest were asked by the rest. I hope you also both enjoyed your time with us.
Oh yeah, sure. I liked it a lot, and it was a nice discussion. It's always nice to have a nice academical discussion, and this was one of them. Yeah,
thanks so much, Eirini and Antonio. Really, and Jan as well. I really enjoyed the discussion of today. And let me also announce that we plan to have something like a workshop or a colloquium towards the end of the project. So that's the summer 2023 on replication across different disciplines. So a lot of these issues will come up again then and addressed in even more detail, hopefully.
Okay. Sounds wonderful.
Yeah, and when we start marketing, look at the picture next to my head as well. It's about the Research Integrity Conference in Cape Town upcoming this June.
Very good, very good. Now, and we hope to meet you face to face as well in the coming months.
That would be nice. Okay, good luck with your reproducibility.
Thank you.
Great initiative.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jan.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye, Jan.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day.
Bye.